What's up, Internet? This is Rambling Josh, and today I want to talk about something a little bit different. Normally, the things that I look for in games and the things that inspire me to talk about them are just kind of gameplay and overall game design and that kind of stuff. But today I want to talk about narrative in fictional worlds specifically. I'm going to be talking in regards specifically to games, but it's something that's applicable to pretty much any medium, whether it be like books or movies. And this is inspired by, I've been playing Horizon Zero Dawn recently, which I say playing, I finished it. It's a very, very good game. I enjoyed it a lot. That's not what I'm talking about here, but just as a side, like if you haven't played it, you really should because it's really good. So anyways, Horizon Zero Dawn addresses an issue that arises in fictional narrative, or fictional world narrative a lot, I think. And I found it kind of interesting because one of the ways that it addresses that is very similar to another game that I really love a lot, but I'll be getting into that later. Before I start talking about it specifically, I figured I should take some time to kind of outline the problems that arise in introducing a fictional world to players. So basically the issue here is that when you have a fictional world that the player knows nothing about going into it, I mean, that in itself is the problem, is the player doesn't know anything about the world or the characters or the history or the culture or the politics or the religions or anything going into it. When they press start, that's pretty much when the world starts existing for them. But for the world itself and for the characters within the world, it probably existed for hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of years going into it, depending on how much effort the writers put into like backstory and whatever. So it's kind of difficult to communicate that to the player because there's kind of this disconnect between what the inhabitants of the world knows and what the player knows. And it's especially troubling in video games because typically in a game your character has like a main character, which is essentially their avatar in the world. And one assumes that if you're playing like, say, like some 20-something-year-old character, that they would have some level of knowledge of this world as well. And then that's even worse when the main character and the player has a disconnect in knowledge, because it's kind of hard to relate to your main character in that case if they just have all the answers and you don't, and it's just like, oh well, where did that nugget of wisdom come from? When did you learn that? Like, I don't know, right? So basically the issue is that the writers have to find a way to give the player or the reader or the watcher or whatever the knowledge that they require to understand and interact in this world without kind of breaking the suspension of disbelief. And I mean, there are different ways of doing this. You could just very simply have just like a plain narration. That works a lot of the time in like books. Books are very heavy on narration, but movies and games are a little bit different. Games especially, because in a game you're someone who is interacting directly in the world. And like I said, you have your main character who is like an avatar. It's an active medium, whereas in books and movies it's like you're a spectator. So if it's fitting for there to just be a lot of narration, then it's not all that bad. But in a game, having a lot of narration where the player isn't actually doing anything except for reading walls of text, then it's like that's one of the worst ways to communicate information in a game. Sometimes the way this is done is kind of just by like throwing the player in the deep end, so to speak. You just kind of throw them into the universe and don't worry too much about giving them all the backstory and all that, and just kind of pretend that this world has existed and you're just kind of jumping in the middle. And that's kind of that works pretty well sometimes. That's not really a whole answer though. An example I like to give for this is Xenosaga, specifically the first game. I don't remember the second or third one very well, but in Xenosaga Episode 1, it's actually handled pretty poorly in my opinion. basically, like, this is a game that is full of like 3 out of every 10 words is some kind of like technical jargon, and they don't really take the time to explain much of it. They just kind of talk about it and hope you understand what they're saying. And the way that they kind of get around this is they give you a codex that basically is just a dictionary of all of these phrases. And that kind of works, but it's making the assumption that if the player cares what you're talking about, then they're going to have to spend like hours reading through what is essentially a dictionary. And that's kind of lame. That I don't think that works very well. Like, you have the advantage of it maintains the suspension of disbelief fairly well, because you're not taking the time to walk the player through everything that ideally the main character should already know. And that kind of brings me to what is more commonly done, I think. And when it's done well, it works a lot better, in my opinion. And that's just handling it through dialogue, basically. So what writers can do is they craft their situations, and they very carefully choose their words when characters are talking, so that even though they're talking to each other, they're also talking to the player, so that what they're saying gives the player the information that they need to understand what's going on and exist in this world. But you kind of run the risk doing that of you also have to maintain the suspension of disbelief. So when you hear a character saying something that maybe they shouldn't be saying, or someone is asking a question that you think they should already know the answer to, then sometimes you kind of get the situation where it's like, you kind of ask yourself, like, well, shouldn't you know that? Like, you kind of, sometimes you might get a little hint of like, okay, my character should know that. They're really asking, like, the reason this question is really being asked is for my benefit as the player. And that kind of pulls you out of the experience a little bit, I think. It's good to have the information, but you don't want to know that you're the one being talked to. You want it to be an exchange between the characters in the game. You want to be in the game. That's the goal. So, all of this to basically say that the way that Horizon Zero Dawn does this is very similar to the other game I mentioned at the beginning of this video, was Final Fantasy X. Zero Dawn and Final Fantasy X kind of handle this in kind of the same way. They go about it a little bit differently, but basically the goal here is to have a main character who it makes sense for them to not know things, basically. And that's kind of a problematic trope in some ways, because that's basically what leads to the trope of like the amnesiac character. Because if your character doesn't know anything, then it makes sense for them to be asking questions. It makes sense for people to explain everything to them. And it works narratively, because if you're like, oh, why is there a problem with these people over here? And then someone's just like, oh, well, don't you know that? And then your character's like, oh, no, I lost my memory. And they're like, oh, well, okay, here's everything you need to know about those people over there. It works. The amnesiac trope is a trope, though. Nobody really likes amnesiac characters these days. It's overdone. It feels lazy, almost. Because you're basically taking a character and you're making them just a nobody, basically. One assumes that an amnesiac will have some kind of like backstory or past that's revealed later. So it's not necessarily lazy, but it's like, it's done enough at this point that it's not the most believable, or it's not the most convincing. So having a more convincing way of your character not knowing the things that inhabitants of your world should know is kind of the goal, I think. And so, getting on to Horizon Zero Dawn and Final Fantasy X, the way that these games do it is they essentially have main characters who are basically, they're from another world. In Horizon Zero Dawn, you play Aloy, who, for one thing, you see Aloy from birth, basically. So you have a little bit less of the disconnect of my main character knows things that I don't, because you experience sort of her entire life. You see her as a baby, you see her as a, I think, 6-year-old, and you see her as a 19-year-old. And points in between are just kind of like, yeah, okay, she grew up. But you kind of get a sense of who she is, and her story is that she grew up as an outcast from her tribe. So she was raised in the wilds by a single man named Rost, but it kind of makes sense that she spent her entire life not interacting with the people, in fact shunned by the people of her village. So when she doesn't know their customs, when she doesn't know the people there, when she doesn't know anything about the rest of the world outside of the little sliver of land where she grew up, it makes sense. It makes sense why you don't know these things. And kind of the same goes for Tidus in Final Fantasy X. In fact, I think Final Fantasy X does an even better job of this. A lot of people really hate on the story of Final Fantasy X, and I kind of don't blame them. Its story is not that great in the grand scheme of things. It's a typical Final Fantasy X story. But even as a kid, I was always very impressed by the way that the story was communicated to the player, and I thought it was very effective even back then. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about now, because you have some of the same effect in Horizon Zero Dawn, but like I said, I think it's much more powerful in Final Fantasy X. So in Final Fantasy X, you play as Tidus, who grew up in Zanarkand, and then at the beginning of the game, he's transported to Spira, which is an entirely different world. You find out that there are some strange connections between them as the game goes on, but essentially from hour one of the game, you're in an entirely new world that Tidus knows nothing about, which is ironic. Well, not ironic, but it's a very convenient coincidence because guess what? The player doesn't know anything about it either. And that's where the real strength of this tactic of communicating narrative works, because as I was saying before, one of the biggest places that disconnects can happen is when the main character knows things that the player doesn't, or when the main character has to ask questions that someone that lives in this world shouldn't have to ask. So basically making it such that the main character has neither of those expectations, it works out really well. Because it means that as the main character is exploring this world, as they're learning more about this world, so is the player. They're learning about it at the exact same pace as their avatar in this world. So once they learn something outrageous, then they're going to have the same reaction that the player does. And Final Fantasy X, there's a lot of moments where it's like, whoa, why is this happening? Like, why is that the way that is? Why is whatever, without spoiling anything. And the one of the big strengths of this is that Tidus is going to react the way that you would expect that the player is going to react to that as well. So it works out very nicely. You're learning at the same pace. You have someone in the world who is reflecting the way you also are learning about it, the way you react to it. You're experiencing everything at the same pace, and it all just really works out very well. I mean, it's kind of just a little thing, really. But to me, having that kind of layer of it makes sense for my character to be asking questions, and it makes sense for people to be explaining things to me, it's really nice because it makes the experience so much more solid when I don't feel like things are being explained for my benefit. They're being explained for my character's benefit. In fact, like in Final Fantasy X, that was like a whole thing. Like there's a whole character, Lulu, who she takes to explaining everything to Tidus, and as the game goes on, she kind of just assumes that he doesn't know anything. So she almost becomes like a narrator, but she's also a character in the game. It's kind of interesting. But anyways, like I'm not like a story guy. I'm not a big like storyteller. But this is just something that I've noticed in a few games, and like I said, I was very struck as a kid at how effective this was at pulling me into the world of Spira in Final Fantasy X. And so seeing something like this again in Final Fantasy, or not Final Fantasy X, in Horizon Zero Dawn was very refreshing, because that is one of the things that I enjoyed about Zero Dawn, is the fact that it did feel like it is a captivating world that pulled me into it. And I was interested in people there, I was interested in the different tribes, I was interested in Aloy and all this stuff. So I find this method to be very effective. Obviously, any effective method, if overused too much, is not a good thing, hence the amnesiac trope, but I don't know. I just felt like talking about it a little bit. So, that's about it for me, so I will catch you later.